Stand at the foot of Perth Street in Brockville, Ontario, on a clear morning and look north. The hill rises from the St. Lawrence lowlands in a long, gradual slope, past the Victorian neighborhoods, past the water tower, past the edge where the town's ordinary architecture thins out and something larger takes its place. And there, on the crest, you can still see it. The main building, what was 4 stories of limestone and red brick, its central tower still rising above the roofline, its south-facing windows still looking back down the hill toward the river and the town below. This was the Brockville Asylum for the insane. Later, the Brockville Mental Hospital. Later still, Brockville Psychiatric Hospital. A building on a hill above a river town that looked down for 12 decades at a community that looked back up and chose, collectively, to treat what was happening behind those limestone walls as a matter that did not require public discussion. To understand what Brockville became, you have to understand the Ontario asylum system that produced it, not as an accident, not as a local peculiarity, but as the deliberate institutional expression of a provincial government that had decided, in the years following Confederation, that the mentally ill of Ontario required a solution and that the solution would be architectural. The Lunacy Act of 1873 codified what had been developing piecemeal across the province for decades. The legal framework for committing a person to a provincial asylum, requiring the signature of 2 physicians and a justice of the peace, and establishing the provincial government as the funding authority for institutional care. The act was progressive by the standards of its era. It replaced the practice of housing the mentally ill in county jails and poorhouses with the idea that dedicated therapeutic facilities were the humane alternative. What the act also created, as a practical matter, was an expanding provincial commitment to build and maintain large residential institutions, whose populations, once admitted, had no mechanism for contesting their admission, no advocate independent of the institution itself, and no timeline on their stay. John Woodburn Langmuir, the Inspector of Prisons and Public Charities, appointed in 1868, spent his tenure systematizing the provincial asylum network with the thoroughness of a man who believed that good record-keeping and good institutional design were the same thing as good outcomes. He tracked admission rates and death rates and agricultural yields from the institutional farms with equal precision. He was, by any measure, a capable administrator. He was also building a system in which the only people without a voice in how the system operated were the people the system had been built to serve. Under his tenure, the provincial government committed to a new institution for Eastern Ontario. It needed a site. It needed a town willing to host it. Brockville raised its hand. The world that built Brockville's asylum was not indifferent. It was certain, and certainty, in an institution with no one accountable to the people inside it, does its own kind of damage. The man most directly responsible for locating the Brockville Asylum on its hill above the St. Lawrence was not a physician. He was a committee, but the chairman of the site selection committee, a local businessman and town councillor named Henry Beamish, understood something that the provincial architects, who eventually drew the plans, confirmed. Height was medicine. The moral treatment movement that shaped North American asylum design in the mid-19th century held, with the conviction of an era that had not yet learned to distinguish correlation from mechanism, that elevation was therapeutic. Higher ground meant cleaner air. Higher ground meant distance from the moral contamination of city life. Higher ground meant a view, and the view, in the therapeutic ideology of the era, was not merely pleasant, but curative. The patient who could see a wide prospect was a patient whose disordered mind was being organized by the horizon's regularity. The site selected in 1876 sat on the crest of the hill north of Brockville's commercial core, 40 acres of cleared farmland with a sightline south across the St. Lawrence that, on a clear day, took in the American shore. The provincial government purchased the land, approved the design, and appointed the first medical superintendent, Dr. William White Metcalf, a Queen's-trained physician who had served in the county jail's medical role and understood, better than most, what the alternative to the new institution looked like. Metcalf was a sincere believer in the moral treatment model. His first annual report, submitted to the inspector in 1877, describes the site's advantages with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believes the hill will help. The elevated position, commanding as it does a prospect of singular beauty and extent, cannot fail to exert a beneficial influence upon those whose nervous constitutions have been disordered by the confined and turbulent conditions of city life. He was wrong about the mechanism. He was not wrong about wanting to help. The difference between those two facts would take a century to resolve, and the people it resolved itself on were the ones in the building at the top of the hill. The Brockville Asylum was designed by the provincial architect Kivas Tully in a modified Kirkbride plan, the American institutional design philosophy, developed by psychiatrist Thomas Kirkbride, which held that the physical organization of the building itself was a therapeutic instrument. The Kirkbride plan arranged patient wards in a long, extended wing on either side of a central administrative block. The wings angled slightly forward from the center, so that each ward's windows faced south toward the sun, toward the view, toward the air that the cure required. The ward windows at Brockville faced directly down the hill and directly into the Brockville townscape, the market square, the courthouse dome, the steeples of St. Peter's and St. Lawrence Anglican, the glitter of the river beyond. The central tower rose 60 feet above the main roofline. Not a water tower, not a clock tower, but an architectural statement. The building was important. The building was permanent. The building was watching. From inside the tower's upper level, on a clear day, you could see for 20 miles in 3 directions. From every ward corridor on the south face, patients could see the town. The ground floor housed the administrative functions. The superintendent's office with its broad oak desk, the admitting room where the committal papers were filed and the patient's name was entered in the register, the dispensary, the medical examination room. The wards above were organized by floor, according to the institution's classification of patient acuity. The most stable patients on the lower floors, with access to the grounds, the most disturbed patients on the upper floors, where the windows looked out, but the doors did not open. The farm occupied the land north and east of the main building, 30 acres of kitchen garden, orchard, dairy barn, and grain field that provisioned the institution through the growing season. The farm superintendent's office was a modest building at the field's edge. His records, filed quarterly with the provincial government, documented yield and labor hours in 2 parallel columns that told, between them, the story the institution preferred to tell about itself: productive, self-sufficient, ordered, therapeutic. The view from those south-facing ward windows was the building's most deliberate feature. It was also, in a way that none of the designers intended, and none of the early administrators recorded, the building's most honest one. The patients looked down at the town. The town looked up at the building. And between those two gazes, for the next 120 years, an agreement settled into place. In its first 2 decades, the Brockville Asylum operated within the buoyant idealism of the moral treatment era, the institutional conviction that the right environment, properly organized, could restore a disordered mind to order. The farm produced. The wards maintained a cleanliness that the provincial inspector's annual visits confirmed. Patients whose conditions permitted it walked the grounds in supervised groups, tended the kitchen garden, attended the weekly concerts held in the main hall, where staff and patients shared the same benches. Patient correspondence from the asylum's early years, letters collected by the Brockville Museum and archives from surviving family donations, describes a reality more complicated than the annual reports provided to Queen's Park. Some writers describe genuine gratitude, a warmth in certain nurses, a relief at the routine, a sense that the hill had, in some specific way, quieted something that the city had made unbearable. These letters are real. The gratitude in them is real. Other letters describe something else. One woman, writing to her sister in Kingston in the summer of 1886, used the phrase "watched from every direction" to describe the ward corridors. She did not mean it as a complaint about the staff. She meant it as a physical description of the architecture. The corridor design, which placed the nurse's station at the junction point of each wing, created a sightline that ran the full length of the ward in both directions. It was a design feature of the Kirkbride plan, built for supervision, described in institutional literature as a safety advantage. In the letter it reads differently. She wrote, "One does not escape the sense of being always seen, even when nothing wrong is being done." The provincial inspector's annual report for 1889 describes Brockville as one of the most capably administered institutions in the provincial system. The report notes the farm's productivity with evident satisfaction. It does not quote the letter. Both documents are in the archive. They describe the same institution from positions that the archive has never been required to reconcile. Something was already in the architecture that the annual reports could not see. The First World War did not destroy the Brockville Asylum's therapeutic ambitions. It simply made them impossible to sustain. Staff left for military service in numbers the institution could not replace. Nurses, attendants, farm workers, the people whose presence and attention were the delivery mechanism for everything the moral treatment model required, departed for service in sufficient numbers that the wards that remained became the responsibility of whoever remained. By 1917, the patient-to-staff ratio in the Brockville wards had deteriorated to a point that the acting superintendent acknowledged, in a letter to the inspector, as beyond the operational minimum for therapeutic programming. The letter used the phrase, operational minimum. The patients in those wards experienced it as something more specific. The end of the individual attention that the moral treatment model had promised, and the beginning of the ward management that would define the institution for the next 40 years. The Depression drove admission rates across Ontario's provincial institutions to historic highs. Poverty, malnutrition, and the specific dislocation of lives that had been organized around work and had lost it drove people to breakdown. And breakdown, in Ontario, in 1932, had one institutional destination. The Brockville wards, that had been designed to hold 250 patients, held 400 by 1935. The dormitories built for 30 held 50. The individual clinical attention that had been strained in 1917 was, by the late 1930s, a theoretical aspiration, described in annual reports, that the building's actual conditions did not support. The institution that the Great War had stressed and the Depression had overwhelmed became, through the 1940s and 1950s, something that its founders would not have recognized as the institution they had designed. Not through the malice of any individual, but through the slow, institutional logic of a system that had been given too many people, too few resources, and no one with authority standing outside it, asking whether what was happening inside still resembled what it was supposed to be. The building on the hill kept looking down at the town. The town kept looking up at the building. And the agreement between those two gazes hardened into something that would outlast both of them. The provincial psychiatric system's relationship with Indigenous patients in the mid-20th century was not uniform across institutions, and Brockville's version of it was shaped by the geography of Eastern Ontario, a region whose Indigenous communities, primarily Mohawk and Algonquin, were dispersed across a wide area, serviced, in theory, by the Federal Indian Health Services infrastructure. In practice, Indigenous patients arrived at Brockville through a referral system that combined provincial psychiatry, Federal Indian Health Services, and the particular jurisdictional gaps that the two systems created between them. Federal jurisdiction over Indigenous health and provincial jurisdiction over psychiatric institutions produced a category of patient for whom nobody was clearly responsible, and in the administrative logic of mid-century Ontario, the patient for whom nobody was clearly responsible became the patient whose care was most easily neglected. Indigenous patients at Brockville in the 1940s and 1950s were admitted to general population wards, where no interpreter was available for patients whose primary language was not English, where the clinical intake process was conducted in a language many patients could not fully navigate, and where the admission notes that would govern their treatment, the notes that determined diagnosis, medication, and labor assignment, were produced from interviews whose fundamental communicative premise was compromised before the first question was asked. The admission records for Indigenous patients in this period carry, with disproportionate frequency, the notation, patient, non-communicative, history incomplete. The institutional description of a language barrier the institution was not equipped to address, and not required by any provincial standard to address. That notation was then used to inform the clinical picture. A patient who could not communicate the history of what had brought them to Brockville was a patient whose history the institution felt entitled to supply from whatever was available. The referral note, the federal file, the observation of the admitting attendant. The resulting clinical picture was often wrong. The treatment built on it was built on the wrong picture. No record has been found of a formal complaint about this process reaching the provincial inspector's office during the relevant period. The patients whose admissions it describes were not in a position to file formal complaints. They were in the wards. Dr. Samuel Doyle was appointed medical superintendent of Brockville in 1947, arriving from a career in military psychiatry that had given him both clinical experience with acute psychiatric presentations and the administrative conviction that large institutions could be managed efficiently if the management systems were sound. He was not an unkind man. The correspondence he left behind, annual reports, letters to the ministry, internal memos, describes someone who genuinely engaged with the clinical literature of his era, who attended conferences, who read the emerging research on biological psychiatry with the attention of a man keeping up with a field that was moving quickly. He believed, with the confidence that the published consensus of his era provided, that the biological treatments newly available to psychiatry, electroconvulsive therapy, insulin coma therapy, the early antipsychotics, represented genuine advances over the custodial model he had inherited. He introduced ECT at Brockville in 1949. He introduced insulin coma therapy in 1951. His annual reports to the ministry describe these interventions in the language of progress. Patients stabilized, wards quieter, the therapeutic program advancing toward the modern standard. His reports were thorough. His documentation was professional. His clinical notes on patients who received ECT described their pre-treatment condition and their post-treatment observation with the even hand of a physician who considers the intervention he is describing to be standard care. What is absent from those notes is any documentation of a consent process that would satisfy any standard of informed consent recognizable in the literature that was already developing around him in the same years. The consent framework for ECT was contested in the clinical literature of the 1950s. Some institutions were developing written consent procedures. Some were relying on committal papers as authorization for all subsequent treatment. Some were occupying the space between those positions without examining it. Doyle occupied that space without examining it. His notes document what was done. They do not document whether the patients understood what was about to be done or whether they had been given any meaningful opportunity to decline. The irony was complete and institutional. The most thorough and conscientious superintendent the hospital had employed in a generation was running a biological treatment program that the developing ethics literature of his own era would have required him to administer differently, and the thoroughness of his documentation preserved in permanent legible form the evidence of what he had not done. He retired in 1963 with a commendation from the ministry. He was never investigated. The institutional economy of Brockville Psychiatric Hospital operated through the same federal per diem funding model that shaped every provincial psychiatric institution in Canada, a model that paid institutions for patient days without requiring any external verification that the care being delivered matched the clinical classification generating the payment. Federal health transfers flowed to Ontario, which distributed them to institutions based on resident counts. A long-stay patient who had been stable for years generated the same per diem as a patient in active acute care. The financial incentive embedded in this model pointed consistently toward retention. Each day a patient remained was a day of federal and provincial funding, and a patient retained indefinitely was a patient whose care cost the institution less per day, as their needs became more predictable and their routines more institutional. The farm at Brockville offset operational costs through the same patient labor mechanism documented across Ontario's provincial institutions. Patients classified as suitable for occupational therapy, a designation determined by clinical staff with no external audit mechanism, worked the farm fields, the kitchen, the laundry, and the grounds maintenance. Their labor was documented in the farm superintendent's quarterly reports as therapeutic activity. Its financial contribution to institutional operations appeared in the ministry's annual estimates as reduced operating costs without the line item that would explain the reduction. No ethics board existed at Brockville at any point during the first 70 years of its operation. The ethics board infrastructure that Canadian hospitals began developing through the late 1960s did not reach provincial psychiatric institutions with the speed it reached general hospitals. The regulatory gap was not a deliberate design. It was the accumulated product of a system that had been built without external accountability mechanisms and had never been required to add them. Between the absent ethics board and the absent external audit, the institution that held between 400 and 600 patients at any given point in the post-war decades was accountable. In practice, only to the ministry that funded it, and the ministry that funded it received annual reports that described the institution in the clinical language the institution had chosen to describe itself with. Nobody was required to read those reports against the ward notes. Nobody was required to read the ward notes against the admission registers. Nobody was required to read the admission registers against the records of the burial ground on the northeast corner of the property. The daily experience of psychiatric treatment at Brockville in the 1950s and 1960s was organized around a biological intervention protocol that the institution administered with the consistency of an established clinical program, which, in the terms of its era's published literature, is exactly what it believed it was delivering. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered in a dedicated room on the second floor of the central block, reached from the ward corridor by a short stairway that patients learned the specific meaning of. The procedure in its early years was performed without general anesthesia, standard in the first decade of ECT's clinical use, meaning the convulsion induced by the electrical current was full body and unmodified. Patients were held down on the treatment table by staff. The sound the procedure made was audible on the corridor outside. Patients returning to the ward after treatment were disoriented for hours. Some patients were told the procedure would help them. Some were told very little. Some were told nothing. The determination of what to tell them was left to the ward physician, whose documentation of pre-treatment communication, where it exists, is formulaic in ways that suggest category completion rather than specific conversation. Insulin coma therapy was administered on a dedicated ward, equipped with the monitoring equipment the protocol required, the glucose injections, and the reversal procedures ready beside each bed, because the coma the insulin induced could, if the reversal was delayed, become a different kind of permanent. Patients receiving insulin coma therapy entered a coma state multiple times per week across a treatment course that ran for weeks or months. The theory was that the metabolic disruption would reset the disordered neurological patterns that psychosis expressed. The theory was never confirmed by the clinical trials that later researchers conducted. It was believed in the 1950s, with the sincerity that comes from wanting a thing to be true and having, for a moment, data that appeared to support the wanting. Patients who experienced the insulin coma course described it in survivor testimony collected by the Ontario Psychiatric Survivor Alliance in the 1980s, in terms that the clinical notes filed at the time do not record. The clinical notes describe the metabolic parameters, the coma depth, the recovery. They do not describe what it was like to be the person in the bed. One testimony, anonymized in the Alliance's published collection, described only as from a former Brockville patient admitted in the mid-1950s, reads, "I thought I was dying every time. Nobody told me I was not dying. I asked once and the nurse said I was resting. I was not resting. I did not know what I was doing." The clinical note from that date reads, "Patient tolerated procedure well, no complications." What happened to the person in that bed belongs to the next section, not to a number, to a name. Numbers, even these numbers, 120 years, 600 patients at peak, an unknown count of numbered graves, become institutional weight without human shape. So let us remember three names. Margaret Okafor was 41 years old in the spring of 1958 when her husband drove her from their home in Prescott to the Brockville Psychiatric Hospital and signed the admission papers. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, had come to Canada in 1942 with her husband Emmanuel, a civil engineer who had been offered a position with a St. Lawrence Seaway construction contractor. They had settled in Prescott, raised 3 children, built a life in the specific way that immigrant families build lives in small eastern Ontario towns, carefully, deliberately, always aware of the attention that difference attracts. Margaret had been treated by her family physician in Prescott for what he described as recurring melancholia with periods of agitation since the early 1950s. Her clinical notes from those Prescott appointments describe a woman who was managing grief, the death of her eldest child in 1949, the sustained pressure of being one of very few black families in a town where that distinction was constant and not always kind, with less and less reserve as the years passed. When she arrived at Brockville, she was assessed and diagnosed with involutional melancholia. She was assigned to the women's ward. Within 3 weeks, she received her first ECT session. Margaret Okafor had, before the melancholia took hold, been the person in the Prescott Anglican congregation who organized the Christmas pageant every year, a detail her daughter Eleanor preserved in the testimony she gave to the Psychiatric Survivor Alliance in 1993. Eleanor described her mother as someone whose specific gift was remembering things, names, dates, the small details of other people's lives that make a person feel seen in a community that doesn't always bother to see them. After the ECT series, 6 sessions over 3 weeks, Margaret's clinical notes describe her as calmer, more compliant, less agitated. What the notes do not describe is that the woman who came back to the ward after the 6th session could not remember Eleanor's birthday, could not remember the name of the Prescott church, could not remember the Christmas pageant, the detail that her daughter held as the most essential fact of who her mother had been. She was discharged in August of 1958. She returned to Prescott. Emmanuel told the children she was rested. The word rested was not accurate, but it was the word available to a man in 1958 who had no other vocabulary for what had been done to his wife inside a building on a hill he drove past twice a week without being told what was happening in it. Margaret Okafor died in 1971. Eleanor filed a complaint with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario in 1995 after reading a newspaper article about ECT practices in provincial hospitals. She was informed that the physician who had authorized her mother's treatment had retired, and that the practices in question were consistent with the clinical standards of their era. The complaint is marked closed. The Christmas pageant is in Eleanor's memory and nowhere else. William Dupuis was 23 years old and a trapper from the Algonquin communities north of Pembroke when he was referred to Brockville in the autumn of 1952 by a federal Indian Health Services physician who had encountered him during a reserve medical visit. The referral note describes William as confused, agitated, non-communicative in English. The clinical picture the note constructed was built on a 15-minute encounter in which William had not spoken because he had been frightened by the setting and the stranger and had expressed this, in the manner of a man for whom silence is not the absence of communication, by being quiet. He arrived at Brockville with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, undifferentiated type, and an admission note that read, "History incomplete, patient non-communicative." His Algonquin language was not accommodated at any point in his assessment. The hospital had no interpreter and was not required to obtain one. William Dupuis worked the Brockville farm from the spring of 1953 through the autumn of 1961. 8 growing seasons, documented in the farm superintendent's quarterly reports under occupational therapy, outdoor program. His clinical notes across those 8 years carry the same observation at regular intervals. Patient stable, nonverbal, compliant with ward routine, nonverbal, in English, in a hospital where no one spoke his language. He was discharged in 1961 when the province's early deinstitutionalization movement created pressure to reduce census numbers. The discharge note describes him as suitable for community placement. He was placed in a rooming house in Brockville. He was 43 years old. His family was 160 miles north of Brockville, near Pembroke, and he had not seen them in 9 years. He made it back. A cousin drove to Brockville when word reached the community, through channels that reservation communities use when their members disappear into provincial systems, that William was being released. He came back north and lived there until his death in 1989. He did not speak, in the accounts of those who knew him in his last years, about Brockville. He did not have to. The 8 growing seasons were in the farm superintendent's quarterly reports. Nobody in the provincial system was required to send those reports north with him. Evelyn Sharp was 57 years old when she was admitted to Brockville in 1964. She was a retired schoolteacher from Gananoque, had taught grade 4 at the central school there for 26 years. A fact that the people of Gananoque, who remembered her in subsequent decades, remembered as the most essential thing about her. She had a gift for children who were difficult, the ones who were slow, and the ones who were frightened, and the ones who acted out, because acting out was the only language available to them. Her former students described her in the Oral History Project, the Gananoque Heritage Society, conducted in the 1990s. With specific consistency, she was the one who made time. She had been managing a bipolar presentation since her 40s, had managed it well, with the support of a family physician who understood that well-managed meant functional, not absent. Her admission to Brockville was precipitated by a manic episode that the physician found beyond what outpatient management could safely contain. She received insulin coma therapy beginning in January of 1965. The treatment course ran for 14 weeks. She was discharged in May of 1965. She returned to Gananoque. She did not return to teaching. The retirement she had been planning was now her only option, because the specific quality of her attention, the patience, the memory for individual children's particular obstacles, the capacity to make time, had been altered in the 14 weeks of insulin coma in a way she could feel and her former colleagues could see, and nobody at the hospital had described as a possible outcome when the treatment was proposed. She lived in Gananoque until 1981. She attended the reunions that her former students organized for her because the students organized them, and she could not think of a reason to say no. She sat at the head of the table at those reunions, and she was kind, and she was warm, and she was present in the specific way of a person who has decided to be present even when something that used to make the presence effortless is no longer there. She never filed a complaint. She told her niece, in a conversation the niece recorded in the Oral History Project, that she did not believe she would be believed. She was not wrong about the decade she was living in. These three represent hundreds more. The patients whose names are in the admission register and whose stories are not in any document the province has produced or funded. The patients whose discharge notes say suitable for community placement, without asking what community meant for a man who had not seen his family in 9 years. The patients whose graves in the northeast corner of the property carry numbers that nobody has been required to match. They are owed a reckoning. The records that would constitute it are in the archive. The reckoning has not come. In 1969, the Ontario Ministry of Health commissioned an internal review of conditions across 5 provincial psychiatric institutions. The review was not triggered by survivor complaint or by journalistic investigation. It was triggered by the deinstitutionalization policy discussion that was beginning to reshape provincial thinking about the long-term psychiatric model, a discussion in which ministry planners needed current data about institutional conditions in order to make credible population reduction projections. The review committee examined staffing ratios, patient programming, physical plant conditions, and clinical record quality at each of the 5 institutions. Brockville was among them. The committee's report, completed in the spring of 1970 and distributed to senior ministry officials, described Brockville's conditions in the following terms, as documented by researchers at Queen's University who obtained a partially redacted version through a Freedom of Information request in 2004. Substandard in patient programming and staffing ratios, with clinical records insufficient for retrospective audit of treatment outcomes. The report was not published. It was not shared with the Ontario Medical Association, the Canadian Mental Health Association, or any patient advocacy organization. It was not provided to the families of patients then currently admitted to Brockville. It was used by ministry budget planners as a data input for the deinstitutionalization capacity modeling that produced the census reduction targets of the early 1970s. The reforms it implied improved staffing ratios, enhanced programming, better clinical documentation were implemented gradually across the 1970s, described publicly as a modernization of the provincial psychiatric system in response to evolving clinical standards. The 1969 review that had identified the specific deficiencies driving those reforms was not referenced in any public ministry communication. The patients whose conditions the review had characterized as inadequately documented were not told what the review had found about them. The review mentioned, in a section that the 2004 Freedom of Information release left unredacted, the burial ground on the northeast corner of the Brockville property. It described the numbered markers. It noted that the institution's records did not appear to contain a complete reconciliation of burial numbers against admission register entries. It recommended that a formal survey be conducted. No formal survey has been conducted. The recommendation is in the 1969 review. The 1969 review is in the ministry archive. The burial ground is on the northeast corner of the former hospital property. The relationship between those 3 facts has never been the subject of any proceeding the Ontario government has established. Not one superintendent was investigated. Not one ministry official was asked to account for using the review's findings without disclosing that the findings existed. Not one family of a patient described in the review as inadequately documented received any communication from the province. The survivors who began to organize in the 1970s and 1980s, as deinstitutionalization scattered the long-term populations of Ontario's psychiatric hospitals into communities that had no infrastructure to receive them, were people carrying both the weight of what had happened inside institutions like Brockville and the disorientation of being released into a world that had changed in the years they had been away from it. The Ontario Psychiatric Survivor Alliance, founded in the early 1980s by former patients, including survivors of Brockville, Queen Street, and the Hamilton institutions, documented survivor testimony, pursued freedom of information requests, and testified before Ontario legislative committees, with the persistence of people who had learned that persistence was the only available tool. The Alliance's 1988 report on ECT practices in Ontario psychiatric institutions, a document prepared from survivor testimony and partially available clinical records, described the consent practices at Brockville in terms that the ministry received and acknowledged and did not act upon with any mechanism that addressed the historical record. Brockville Psychiatric Hospital was formally closed in 1976 as a psychiatric institution, part of the deinstitutionalization wave that reduced Ontario's large institutional populations across the decade. The closure was an administrative transition. Patients were discharged or transferred to smaller facilities. The building was not immediately demolished. The provincial government transferred the property through a series of administrative arrangements across the following decades. Portions of the site were redeveloped. The main building's status changed as ownership changed. The burial ground on the northeast corner was identified in some provincial property transfer documents and not in others. In 2019, the Ontario Heritage Trust designated elements of the Brockville site as having heritage significance. The designation covers the architectural and historical character of the surviving built fabric. It does not reference the patient labor program. It does not reference the ECT consent failures. It does not reference the 1969 ministry review or its burial ground recommendation. The plaque describes the institution's historical role in Eastern Ontario's psychiatric care history. The history the plaque describes is accurate as far as it goes. The model that produced Brockville's specific combination of geographic isolation, institutional economy, and absent accountability did not begin in Brockville and did not end there. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, Bedlam, the origin of the word, operated on the same foundational logic for 6 centuries. The MAD are a category apart, their containment a social function, their care a management problem rather than a rights question. The institutional geography that placed Bedlam outside the City of London walls in the 13th century placed the Brockville Asylum on the hill above the town in 1876 for the same foundational reason. The institution should be near enough to receive its population and far enough that its population does not require the town to engage with it directly. In the United States, the state hospital system that developed in parallel with Ontario's provincial system, Willard, Danvers, Traverse City, St. Elizabeth's, operated under the same absent accountability structure and produced, in documented cases that have been the subject of American investigative journalism and academic research, the same pattern of outcomes: numbered graves in institutional cemeteries, suppressed internal reviews, biological treatments administered without consent, documentation adequate to the standards developing around them, and the same institutional immunity from the questions that survivors eventually learn to ask. The World Health Organization's Mental Health Atlas, updated every 5 years since 2001, tracks the global gap between mental health need and mental health resource provision. The gap in 2001 was substantial. It has not substantially closed. The institutional logic that Brockville represented, the removal of the mentally ill to a designated place where the community's responsibility for them is discharged by the act of removal itself, persists wherever mental health funding falls below the threshold at which community-based care becomes genuinely available. The Hill is a permanent architectural solution to a question that communities prefer not to answer in public. What do we owe to the people we cannot manage? Brockville answered that question by building something at a distance from which the question looked answered. The main building of the former Brockville Psychiatric Hospital still stands on its hill above Perched Street. It has not been demolished. It is not, as of the most recent publicly available information, been fully repurposed. The limestone and brick exterior that Kives designed in 1876 is intact on the south face, the face that looks down at the town, the face the town has been looking up at for 148 years. The south-facing ward windows are still there. Some have been boarded, some are intact. From the lower city, on a clear morning, the window openings are visible against the limestone, a row of dark rectangles on the upper floors, looking out at the same view they have always had: the river, the courthouse dome, the steeples, the daily life of a city that looks back. The burial ground on the northeast corner of the property is documented in the 1969 Ministry Review, in the Ontario Heritage Trust's property records, and in academic research conducted by historians at Queen's University. The numbered markers are described in those documents. Whether the markers are intact, whether the ground has been disturbed by any of the property transactions of the intervening decades, is not a matter of confirmed public record. The admission register for the Brockville Asylum is in the Archives of Ontario. It contains names. The burial ground contains numbered markers. Between those two facts sits the specific question that the 1969 review identified, recommended be addressed, and that the ministry filed without acting on. No provincial government has announced a plan to conduct the survey the 1969 review recommended. No heritage organization has been funded to match the numbered markers to the register. No process has been established to notify the families of patients whose names are in the register and whose remains may be in the ground. The building is on the hill. The town is below. The two are still looking at each other across the same distance they have maintained for 148 years. There are two Brockville Psychiatric Hospitals in the historical record. The first was built by a province and a town that genuinely believed, with the conviction of an era that had, for once, an alternative to the county jail, that the hill, the view, the farm, and the organized routine of a well-managed institution could do what the streets of the lower city could not: restore a disordered mind to some version of the life it had been unable to sustain. That first institution had real achievements. Some patients improved. Some left the hill better equipped for the world below than they had arrived. The nurses who wrote about their patients with genuine attention, the superintendents who read the clinical literature and tried to bring it to bear in underfunded circumstances, the farm supervisors who found, sometimes, that the outdoor work produced something that looked like peace. These were real. That first Brockville deserves its name. The second Brockville was the same building, the same hill, the same view, running through an overcrowded century on patient labor that it called therapy, administering biological treatments. It documented without documenting the consent that the developing ethics of its own era had begun to require, housing a 1969 ministry review in a file rather than in a public accounting, and maintaining a burial ground whose numbered markers have never been matched to the names they correspond to. Both Brockvilles looked down at the same town. Both institutions described themselves in annual reports that the town did not read and that the ministry filed. The difference between them is not in the limestone or the brick. It is in the question that the view from the south-facing windows required someone to ask out loud, what is actually happening in this building, and who is responsible for it? Nobody with authority asked that question for 120 years. That is not a metaphor. It is the duration of the silence. Some questions the record leaves open. How many patients are in the burial ground on the northeast corner of the former hospital property? And how many of those burials are under numbered markers that have never been matched to a name? The 1969 Ministry Review identified the gap. The survey it recommended has not been conducted. The answer is in the archive. The admission register is there, the burial records are there, but the matching has not been done by anyone with the provincial authority and provincial funding to make the result official. What are the full findings of the 1969 Ministry Review beyond the passages released through the 2004 Freedom of Information request? The document exists. It was partially redacted. The redacted portions cover, in the index visible in the released version, sections titled Specific Institutional Findings and Recommended Corrective Actions. Those sections have not been released. Who are the families of the patients whose names are in the admission register, and who have never been told that a provincial review once recommended locating and notifying them? Some of those families are still in Eastern Ontario. Some are not. None has received a ministry communication telling them what the 1969 review found. Will there be a formal survey of the burial ground? The Ontario Heritage Trust's designation covers the built fabric of the site. A formal survey of the burial ground would require provincial authorization, provincial funding, and a provincial decision that the question the numbered markers raise is a question the province is prepared to answer officially. That decision has not been made. The view from the hill, the south-facing windows of the Brockville Psychiatric Hospital looking down across Perth Street and the courthouse dome and the river to the American shore, was the building's most deliberate feature. It was chosen by a site selection committee that believed the view was medicine, chosen by a provincial architect who arranged every ward window to face it, chosen by a philosophy that held the wide horizon curative, the commanding prospect restorative, the elevation therapeutic. At the opening of this story, the view looked like intention, like a government and a town doing something genuinely progressive, putting the building where the air was clean and the view was wide, on the highest ground available, in the service of people who needed the best of what the era could provide. By now you know what the view was. It was a mutual agreement between a building and a town, one looking down, one looking up, both choosing not to say what the looking revealed. The town below saw the building on the hill every day for 120 years. The patients in the building saw the town every day for the duration of their admission. Between those two gazes, a century of institutional silence settled into place and was maintained by everybody who had the authority to end it and chose not to. The view is still there. The windows are still in the south face of the building. The town is still below. And in the northeast corner of the property, where the hill slopes down behind the main building away from the view, the numbered markers are still in the ground. The names are in the archive. The numbers are in the ground. The distance between them is the distance that nobody with authority has yet agreed to cross.